Okay, our next presentation will be done by Mr. Jompie Burger, and he is the CEO of the Dairy Standard Agency. And the primary objective of the Dairy Standard Agency is the promotion of the compliance of milk and other dairy products with milk, with product composition, milk, food safety, and metrology standards. And his presentation will focus on occupational health and safety in the dairy industry, with specific reference to the Dairy Code of Practice for dairy producers.
Thank you for this opportunity to participate in the MPO Dairy School. It's been a few years now that we've been participating, and very nice to share with you what we are doing in terms of the DSA audits. So just briefly to explain to you that the dairy industry is no different from all the other industries that we have in the food sector. We just as exposed to all of them in terms of public criticism, corporate responsibilities, and things that can go wrong in the supply chain. So we are jealously trying to protect our value chain by doing what is right. But it doesn't help us always to say that we're doing. We will have to continuously prove that we need to do what is right. So, and that is for two reasons. Obviously, to protect the consumer, but also to avoid economic risks, because normally what you find is that in terms of things going wrong in the value chain in terms of food safety risks or quality risks, it will result into economic risks. And those are related to reactive approaches. And that is what we try to avoid as we carry on. I will explain to you. So if you look at our value chain and the supply chain as such, you will note that we talk about the issues of animal welfare, biosecurity, biotechnology, the environment, fair trade, food safety, and it goes to the point of socio-economic issues, labor and human rights. So a lot of things that the farmers are really exposed to. Now, talking about our regulatory environment, it's very important to note that we must change the way that we think, and that's the philosophy in terms of legislation as well, to follow the risk-based approach. Now, this risk-based approach is not something new. I'm thinking of good examples like HACCP that has found its way into the dairy industry and the food industry, and I think that was in 1995 with the NASA flights that went off to the moon and so forth. But I think the principle is very simple. It's sound, that every stakeholder in our dairy value chain has got a specific role to fulfill. And if we have a situation where we don't control or mitigate the risks at one point in the value chain, the likelihood is there that it becomes a...
Okay, Jompie, jou speaker is net gemute, maar jy kan nou aangaan. Ja, jy kan nou aangaan. Die presentation is op.
Okay, Corlia, can you just scroll down? I'll tell you when to stop. All right, let's continue from there. Next slide. Okay, so we've talked about the regulatory environment. Once again, apologies for this. So what we've spoken about is the risk-based approach that we try to follow through the entire value chain. And that is where the philosophy of new legislation comes in, driven by the principles or the concept of HACCP. So next slide, Kolia. All right, we've spoken about the issue of mitigation of risk, and as much as we are concerned about our dairy products, so are the retailers. Now, if you look at our value chain in principle, we deal within a region of 1,200 milk producers. It's not to say that it's equal to the amount of farms, dairy farms, because there are more farms than milk producers. because some of the producers obviously have more than one milking shed. But yes, let's say we've got 1,000, approximately 200 dairy milk producers, but we have 140 milk processors. Now, looking at that part of the value chain is very critical in the production of milk. Also, to look at the relationship between the milk producer and the processor and the manufacturer of dairy products. So this relationship is key to ensure that we keep the problems where they are and work and eliminate at the same time. Next. The retailers are very much focused on the principle, and one can understand that, in the emerging market and the accommodation of people, of entities that would like to enter into the value chain. One has to look at the minimum, which is then your basic legislation, and which we have in terms of dairy quite very good legislation. So in terms of the retailers and the global market capacity building program that we know, there's room for improvement. So there's a gate, there's a window that one can move through basic compliance to legislation, but you cannot stay there because it's just simply not good enough for sustainability. And that is where, in terms of the Consumer Protection Act, to show due diligence, more has to be done. And in that case, you have the intermediate level, and there you have the elements of legislation combined with government or not government, industry standards, voluntary standards, but also the SABS standards. And that packet goes up to say that you're within the intermediate level. Following that is only when you move on to certification. That makes it possible, then obviously for export purposes as well. So next slide. Now, the next slide talks about this driving the value chain. If we in South Africa talk about compliance, we have to be very careful because there are always a bigger picture. And it's key for us to make sure that whatever we do, and I've often heard that in discussions, we are only doing this because it is required from us. If driven by that argument, then we don't go the way that sustainability requires us to go. So we cannot go according to the pressure that the retailers are putting on the processors. We cannot go according to the argument or the motivation that we are feared or scared of legislation and what may follow in terms of law enforcement. So the whole issue of corporate governance and the international drivers of the United Nations 2030 agenda, all these things do matter. And I think it's very important that we put all these things in a basket and ask the question, what is driving us? And that is the issue of there must be something more. And Cordelia, you can go to the next slide. And there we talk about the issue of what is more. And the real purpose of what I discuss with you is to make sure that we all understand, as input suppliers, as institutions or individuals that's rendering a service to the organized dairy industry, that we understand the issue of creating a culture of compliance. Why do we want that? We are not, the fact that we've been subjected to legislation, it's one thing. Yes, we have an obligation to comply to that. But if we're not driven within ourselves to understand the issue of satisfying the needs of the consumer is important. Yes, compliance should come by itself as an important issue, and make sure that we gain maximum benefit from available technology and risk-based food safety management systems. These things that serve as drivers, and the support of the principles of integrated chain management, like training. Training is a key issue in the integrated chain management, adding value. Besides training, we look at what is required from me as a processor, for example, because my input and my processes will deliver a product, let's say raw milk, and the integrity of the raw milk that must go to the processor. Those things are part and parcel of the makeup. And if we don't bring a culture into doing the right thing all the time, you will see that we don't follow the principles of risk-based approaches. Now, surely we want to make national and international commerce easier to conduct, because if we don't, we will soon be out of business. Next slide. So these are the drivers that really we lay as the foundation. This is quite an old slide of mine because it speaks to, and I keep it because it speaks to what we're trying to achieve. This is integrated chain management, understanding of what the one input supplier must do and what he must do to ensure compliance in terms of his output to the next silo in this line. We need to understand that my output is the input of the next person. If we don't talk about specifications here and compliance and mitigation of risk, we have typical problems relating to, for example, the presence of antimicrobial problems in milk, for example. We have problems like aflatoxin and mycotoxins in raw milk, which we cannot get rid of, obviously, because not even heat manipulation will deal with these issues. So these problems are carried over to the retailer and to the consumer at the end of the day. And that's what about chemical residues originating from crop production? So all these put into the basket, we must make sure that we talk to us. And the purpose of the audit criteria then will serve definitely in the audits to do what? The identification of problems, the hazards itself, the determination of the risk factor we need to evaluate, because risk is nothing else but to determine the severity of that risk. What is the likelihood of that hazard occurring? And the next one obviously would be, what are we going to do about the problems that we identified? So in terms of severity, we know most likely what is the problem, our severity is, and now we need to implement control measures. Those control measures will relate to standard operating procedures and so forth, but very key, where there's a possibility that we can mitigate the risk, that is the next step. And that's the essence, that's the real purpose of the audit criteria, to make it possible for the milk producer or the processor, whoever's in the value chain, to identify those problems, deal with the issues so that we can mitigate the risk and make sure that our consumer at the end of the day is safe and that they will be obviously quite keen to buy the product again next time. Next slide. This is where the risks are. Now, in the fast tracking living environment that we are in, there's always this possibility of people not talking to each other. Now, you can go and find good examples, and I can tell you that always the issue will be where the risks were never, the hazards were never ever properly identified and discussed between the stakeholders. And that is normally between these silos where you will find evidence to that effect, where things go wrong. You can be in one factory at that specific time, and if there's a lack of training, evidence of effective communication, verification steps by means of testing and discussing what is being found, you will have these kind of problems. And so key of importance that whatever we find in the audit and through the identification of risks and discussing these issues, the likelihood is that we will oversee the problems, and that will escalate into a reactive approach. So next slide there, please. We have designed specifically for the organized dairy industry and funded by Milk SA, obviously with the assistance of external stakeholders or role players, the MPO then, and also Milk Producers, the Milk Processors Organization, and other expertise, this code of practice that deals with the issues of what is important. Now, if you do not have a copy of this document, please go to our website at www.dairystandard.co.za and go and please find a copy of this code of practice, because it gives you very clear, systematic guidance into where how to approach when you're at farm level and you need to deal with the issue of whether it's animal health and welfare, hygiene matters, legal requirements regarding structure of the buildings to obtain a certificate of acceptability, for example. All these matters are captured into this wonderful document, and I would strongly advise all role players to get a copy of that. You can simply download it and it's free of charge. It's available to you. Next slide. So this code of practice gives us the foundation of what we try to achieve in terms of the prerequisite programs. What is necessary is we need some systematic, pragmatic approach to develop into suppliers of product that is sound and safe. And as we start at farm level, you will see yourself in a position to ensure good veterinary practices, good laboratory practices, and good hygiene practices. These are fundamental issues covered in our regulations. It's mandatory and it has to be in place. Now, you can see for yourself the importance of the veterinarian, whether it's the private veterinarian, adding value at farm level when it gets to veterinary practices, the laboratory practices, understanding what are the specifications for your product in terms of microbial issues, chemical related matters, and so forth, the frequency of testing, who's testing the milk, and is that facility and where you get your results from, does it come from a reputable laboratory, for example. The hygiene practices also captured in legislation, which forms the basis of whatever we try to achieve. Now, dealing with the matters in terms of PRPs, we're moving on. Remember what I said is that your outputs is the inputs of the processor. Being the inputs, there's manufacturing practices important in terms of PRPs, there's hygiene, there's laboratory practices again, and good distribution practices. It's only once that these systems are in place, covered by legislation and going beyond in terms of voluntary industry and national standards, that we get to HACCP and certification for export purposes specifically. So next slide, please. This is just also an old slide of mine, which I think gives a very good idea. So often we frequent facilities and you start looking at how the owner of the business will approach food safety, for example, and you start looking at the bigger picture and you say to yourself, is this person in charge or the certificate holder organized in terms of what he should be doing? So there should be always a statement of intent that will come as a policy sort of document. So if there's no statement of intent towards food safety and quality and animal health and welfare, you find it very difficult to see the due diligence coming through, because based on the statement of intent that is on the table, the commitment to food safety and animal welfare and so on, there should be something else. And that is the do part, where you experience a due diligence in terms of procedures. If I talk to a farmer and I say, now, please show me your vaccination program that you discussed with your veterinary surgeon at the beginning of the year, for example, you should find the evidence and also the evidence of implementation, of which there should be records. Now, that's just an example. So the records will reflect on the check part. In other words, the law requires you to have evidence of checks, records of when did you treat your animals, with what did you treat them with, if there's withdrawal periods involved, did you go through the entire withdrawal period with your veterinarian at the end of the day to make sure, if necessary, did you test your animals to be accepted back into the milking herd? If things are not in order, it is crucial, it's so important that you will implement the corrective measures. And that's where the ACT part is. So to implement the food safety system at farm level, it's nothing different in principle as doing at the processing. Well, it's completely different in one sense, but it's the same concept, so that you will plan, do, check, and act in the various areas that you need to exercise control over. Now, that progressive step that you've taken will slowly but surely take you to a place where you are mitigating risk, and you will find yourself in a proactive environment rather than being reactive. wait for the pawpaw to hit the fan. Next slide there, please. So in terms of the code of practice, these are simply just examples of the chapters that we are provided for or made provision for in terms of what should be dealt with. You can roll on the Cordia. Next slide. Also, another examples, you can see, for example, chapter 6, biosecurity is well covered. There's a whole program on this where you can even assess yourself in terms of, are you doing what you're supposed to be doing? Then chapter 7, next one, the introduction on general hygiene at the milk parlor, for example, in your milk room, the cleaning procedures that need to be documented and well communicated to your staff, and on which you have to have proper training, for example. Now, 7.8 on the bottom of the page is the issue about training. I think it's very, very important that we don't assume that our staff members that they know what they are doing. They can perhaps work on a washing program and they can work with chemicals of which the wash program that they do have is not applicable anymore because you've changed suppliers, for example. Those things are critical. So training is key. There's absolute ample provision being made by the MPO Institute in terms of training with regard to the food handlers as well, just if you haven't spoken about that already. So we're going to chapter 8 and 9. The guidelines for the development of a documentation that we've already been given guidance on. And then the issue of how do you go about when you prepare yourself for export. If I can just for a moment stop there and say that we've experienced good things from this, what we've designed, the code of practice, because that now serves as the, let's say, the book with the rules. Then you have the audit criteria that is well aligned with this code of practice. And what we've experienced at farm level is that the farm managers and the owners of the business say, but well enough, but tell me how to do this whole documentation system. And we are in the process and we're looking towards the end of May to make available a generic system that will be good enough to serve as a generic document all of our milk suppliers. So in other words, what you do is you take the generic document, it's in electronic format, and you personalize this document to serve the purpose for what you do in terms of the size of your farm and your approach, whether you are on a TMR system and whether you are pasture-based. So it is flexible and is designed in a way that you can make it applicable to your internal processes. Now, again, this is an add-on by the organized dairy industry for our milk producers, and it will be free of charge. It's really there for the purpose of making life easier for everyone to progressively move up into the risk-based approach. Next slide. Right. When we look at the DSA audit criteria, it's key for us to know that in terms of identification, evaluation, and control, that all risks are not the same. So surely you have to, when you do an audit, for example, as the auditors already do, you have to have a system that identify the risk, the severity, and next to it is a weighted system. In other words, we've already determined the severity of the risk, and according to that severity, the likelihood that you might have problems, if it happens, serious problems, you will be scored. So a non-conformance will deal with the issues of a minor, a major, or a critical issue. And surely in terms of the audit criteria that's been developed, there are issues that will relate to an automatic failure. In other words, you can get very close to an 80% on your audit criteria results. There's a likelihood, but you will have one issue in terms of a serious, a critical issue that relates to automatic failure, and that will still lead you to fail the audit. So this system we've been working on for years, and it's trial and tested. And I must say, we even allow for discussions with our clients to determine and discuss some of the criteria, because not all clients are the same. So that is what we have been doing with our audits, and I think it's been designed to be robust, and gone are the days where we work from hard copy books and so on. We've developed it as a whole into a system that is being done on tablets now. And it takes us a few minutes at the end of the audit, at the closure meeting, if there's agreement and some of the issues have been discussed with the farmer, then we press the button and it goes to the office, and that results are very, very quickly made available to the client itself. Next slide. So yes, talking about the audit criteria, again, you can see there are audit fields. Now, these audit fields, again, we follow a systematic approach as per the code of practice to make sure that we cover all those fields according to the risk-based or risk identification program that we have. Next slide, please. Given that and said that, that's what's happening in South Africa. Now, just ladies and gentlemen, to give you the bigger picture, the South African organized dairy industry is part and parcel of the bigger picture in terms of the international dispensation. And there you can see all those little 17 strategic development goals or sustainable development goals of the United Nations. Now, I want to assure you, when it comes to designing a system that will address the issues that we need to address, you will find some activity in terms of the audit criteria that will cover those 17 goals at the bottom of the page. I've given one there as a strategic development goal, sustainable development goal, as SDG 12, but I can assure you, studying literature, you will find them all connected to those 17 goals. What has happened in 2016 is that all the countries that form part of the FAO and the WTO, for example, um, committed themselves to the process when it comes to sustainable development goals, to develop in their countries approach that will assist us to make sure in terms of dairy that we do the right stuff. Now, sustainability does not only deal with the issue of environmental health, it goes beyond. It deals with the issues of social economic issues. It relates to environmental management, for example, and also sustainability in the industry in terms of economics. So by doing these things, it becomes part of the issues that we try to achieve. Now, in South Africa, we know there's a lot of uniqueness. We cannot simply imitate what is happening in the rest of the world. To achieve these goals along the side, we also have to look at what is quite unique in South Africa. And for that purpose, we are very proud of our stakeholders and industry on what we've achieved so far to get to these 70 Sustainable Development Goals, on which we report through the International Dairy Federation. Next slide. Good. There's a declaration in Rotterdam that has been signed also by South Africa. And next slide, we can go on. I think I've already addressed this one. And that's what we cover, talking about our commitments towards our animals, ensuring best care for all our animals, reducing our environmental impact, providing profitability or profitable, nutritious and safe products, and then also creating a rewarding livelihood for those who work in the dairy industry. Next slide. The dairy animal welfare, I think I want to bring it closer to the dairy school topics as we've looked at it now already. Talking about the issue of the importance of dairy animal welfare in the context of sustainability. It's not always fully understood. I think there's a perception there that I do X and Y, that I'm looking after my animals. So we got to be careful with what we say, because you can easily typify a dairy farmer, because it's not the case. We do respect them and we do consider what they do as professional people, really looking after the animals, as also scientists for that matter. Now, I really want to say is there must be an understanding in whatever we try to do, even if it relates to the code of practice, that there's a very interactive approach on the elements such as economy, the environment, animal welfare, and social being. When you look at really being sustainable. Now, these things need to be measured. I've given you the issues on the code of practice. I did discuss with you the issue of biosecurity measures. At the same time, there are measurement criteria for animal welfare as well, and it in principle do address what you see there in bold. So in South Africa, we're absolutely on the right track with the issue of the auditing of the farms, trying to lead us into the proactive rather than the reactive approach. Next slide. Good. So, in general, why should we be so concerned about what's happening in the world? Just to state that, you know what, being a global participant in this dealing with products and really would like to export, although we cannot export currently to the EU, it's very important that the export criteria has changed. In some countries to which you want to export, there are strong emphasis on the export criteria. And as we participate in this global arena, you will find that some of the countries pushing so hard do make it a part of their criteria to ask you, what have you done in terms of your sustainable development goals, and give us evidence to that effect that your house is in order. So we do not deal with these issues as in the past. This whole thing has become now really open, and it's been driven by activists at the same time, looking for more than the usual to see if we are committed to the processes. Fair enough, we take note of that, but in South Africa, speaking generally, it's really bad as an industry not to be on top of it and understanding the same thing that happened to in the polony environment in the meat industry. One example, and the ripple effect that it caused for an industry, and even the pork producers that weren't really the cause of the problem, but they were the suffering party. And this is what also is happening here. Through our value chain, we need to make sure that we cover and protect our industry in terms of a risk-based approach. If we do not mitigate our risks and measure all the time, and problems start to feature, and I'll give you another example. um, the control over the handling of bull calves at farm level, that's a contentious issue. And you will know for yourself that if somebody takes a picture and it gets into the bigger environment of look at what the dairy industry is doing to the welfare of animals, we are in trouble. And there are incidents that did occur in the past, and it will repeat itself if we don't act proactively. And these are just things that we have to be concerned about, and the audit criteria definitely works to that extent as well. Next slide. I've just spoken about that, and here you can see the link between the primary producer, the secondary industry, and the retailer. So we're living absolutely, ladies and gentlemen, in a very competitive environment, and mistakes that we make is not easy to fix in the eye of the consumer. So that's why we've got to be proactive. Next slide. Good. Animal welfare and societal pressures. Public perceptions of farm animal welfare issues have the potential to significantly affect the security sustainability of the dairy industry. Now, all those that are involved in this part of the value chain will understand what could be the effect of something like that. Well, I hope so, because these national and internationally societal pressures that we experience are often driven by a group of people that do not like um, dairy protein, for example. So anything that they can relate to put the dairy industry in a negative context or perspective is easy targets. And that is why it's so important for us to work, base ourselves on science to protect and do what's the right thing. Next slide. Good. What we have done in terms of the code of practice standard of 2018. Let's just see where's the slide. And that relates to the welfare of dairy cattle. Now, for all of you that is in this fraternity or this discipline, will understand that it's something unique and that has to be addressed as by expertise, for example, when you start to measure. So we found it very important to develop our code of practice with an introductory part to the SANS 1694, the development of or the welfare of dairy cattle, but at the same time tried to make available to the industry this South African national standard that's got very strict copyright on it. At the same time, we've developed the audit criteria, which is unique to the South African standard, and that is very important. So from the code of practice, the welfare of dairy cattle also developed a unique standard, and with its unique standard, also the audit criteria that will assist the dairy farmers to make sure we've got a house in order. You can see it's based on South African acts and legislation, International Dairy Federation documents, the ISO standards, the South African national standards, and the code of practice by itself. So we've made a lot of progress to assist our industry in terms of preparing for the way forward, also being able to measure what we do. Next slide. So yes, ladies and gentlemen, the dairy animal welfare and development of the measurement criteria, we took a really long process, but we've developed the audit criteria with in the conjunction with specialists in the field and experts, so that the outcome-based auditable criteria will assist with the identification of specific animal welfare. Very interesting, as I've mentioned previously, with regards to the integrated approach. When we developed this audit criteria, we found out that the criteria that we're looking at, the absolute integration of what you need to look at in terms of the environment. The environment has a direct impact on the welfare of the animals. Hygiene, direct impact on the welfare of the animals. As an example, animal health, direct impact on animal welfare. And so I can carry on. And it was quite difficult to reduce this to really just looking at the topic of animal welfare and not neglect all the other criteria that's important. So next slide, please. There we did the same thing, and obviously we focused on a risk-based approach, and those criteria for the animal welfare audits that is of really importance to specifically address the welfare of dairy cattle. Next slide. And I think if you show the next slide, it's possible that you can just continue there. That's the welfare of dairy cattle. We've worked really hard. We've frequented farms to just look at if we're on the right track, and we verified the audit criteria also in conjunction with the Livestock Welfare Coordinating Committee. And yes, we did find some evidence of issues that is not applicable to South Africa at the end of the day, and that we need to revisit. And for all of our farmers and everyone that is interested in this subject, soon we will go back to the South African standards, SABS standards writer, to make other proposals to make it easier and the audit criteria and the SAN standard more applicable to our farmers, that is either pasture-based or could be TMR, but located in different parts of the country, geographical issues. Next slide. These are just the issues that we address in terms of the welfare of dairy cattle. You can see the requirements: stockmanship, health and wealth, care of management, lameness, mastitis, downer cows, breeding of dairy cattle, the feeding practices and the water, milking procedures, animal management, calving, calf rearing, free stalls, bedding, all that criteria that is dealt with in the South African National Standard, with all its annexures, dealing with the issue of euthanasia, body condition scorecards, teeth scoring, locomotion, lameness, water intake of dairy cattle, and so forth. So we really try to, from this standard, do the best that we can to prove our due diligence at the end of the day. Next slide. There should be more of this. Yeah. What I can say about what we've accomplished, if we apply these things in the right way, there's always this element, and it's of key importance, to deal with the issue of proactive identification and the control thereof. There will always be the element of improvement of communication between those people and the stakeholders. Communication between management and personnel, definitely based on the audits that's being conducted, will improve and assist with healthy decision-making processes. The measurable criteria has a direct influence on the improvement of herd health and animal welfare. Why? Because in the process, we are educating our staff, and also we learn them to implement remedial actions and make quality decisions. High important issue is of high importance is the compliance with the audit criteria, because that will tell you whether you are compliant with the South African National Standard. And at the end of the day, surely it will make trade quite more easier, where you have to comply with other industry requirements in terms of sale. Next slide. The South African National Standards, which I discussed. Next slide, please. Yes, this we can also skip. I think it's well discussed. And here's some of the documentation. Now, I've earlier referred to the issue of documentation, but here you can see what kind of evidence we try to find at farm in terms of TB and CA declarations. Hot topic, because it's quite difficult to find the provincial state veterinarians to get involved in the certification of the farms and even execute the TB and CA test that is required. The register of the vaccines and the antiparasitic products, register of the use thereof, records kept of dairy animal examination by a veterinarian. Very important, because we consider the veterinarian on the farm as a key stakeholder. Register of each animal's treatments, the diseases, record of the daily herd milking processes, name of the veterinarian. You can see how we put this emphasis back on the role of the veterinarian, because he is absolutely the professional person that can deal with these matters. Illness, injuries, and complication during calving. These matters are important. Next slide. The health and welfare of the dairy cattle. The COAs of purchased feedstuffs. Now that to some people will say, but how on earth are we going to manage it? But it's part of the process. If you buy your feeds from a responsible supplier of your concentrates, you need to get a certificate specifically referring to, let's say, mycotoxins. I always ask the question, when you deal with, let's say, facial eczema, where does this find its origin into the feed? That is a fungus producing toxin on ryegrass, for example, that can easily find its way into the herd and make production so difficult, and even the health of the animals will be affected by that. So biosecurity by itself, all these things are important. Next slide. And the herd health for by itself. Next slide. Okay, again, the code of practice talk to all these requirements. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think we've laid the foundation in South Africa for a code of practice. We've got the relevant standards in terms of the code of practice, as well as the standards of the SABS. We've got all the mechanism. We are designing a documentation system that talks to these codes of practice, and also to help the farmer or the farm manager to understand what we try to achieve through the audit criteria. It is not a thing about policing. It's really a thing about identification, evaluation, and control to make sure that we are in a risk-based environment. Next slide. Good. Animal welfare audits and the veterinarian. I think it's very important that we also live in a close environment and make sure whatever we try to achieve in our industry also forms part of what's happening in the discipline of the veterinarian, that we talk to each other. It is important for the veterinarian to always ask, have you been audited? And show me your audit criteria or the audit result, for example. We want to see a discipline where we have through the RUVASA, the Ruminant Veterinary Association, to see if we can find a connection there, that we continuously talk with our rural farmers, for example, to ensure that we understand each other in terms of what needs to be looked at in terms of the requirements of the audit criteria. Surely we're going to add value. We will increase value at farm level in terms of compliance, improvement of communication between the organized dairy industry and the veterinary discipline at the end of the day. Next slide. And I think that's the last one. I want to thank you for listening to me. And once again, my apology for the delay in terms of the technical issues. I hope that you've got some interest in this. Surely we would like to also ask or answer questions in that respect. And if we can assist you in your profession, we will do so gladly. Thank you very much.